February 1945. American prisoners of war are vanishing into the Soviet Union, not violently, not in the chaotic way men disappear during combat, swallowed by the fog of battle and never accounted for. This is quieter than that, more deliberate. These men are vanishing in the particular administrative fashion that only a state apparatus can achieve. The kind of disappearance that happens when a government has already decided an outcome and is using paperwork, delays, and procedural friction to enforce that outcome, all while performing the theatre of cooperation for anyone watching. The prisoners in question are Americans liberated from German camps by the Red Army as it pushes westward through Poland and into eastern Germany during the final months of the European War. Soviet forces are overrunning the Stalags, the sprawling German prisoner of war installations holding Americans, British, and other Allied servicemen captured since the fighting began. Freeing these men is not the objective. It is a side effect. The Red Army is advancing to destroy German military power, not to rescue Allied captives. The camps simply happen to be in the path of the offensive. And so these men are released from German captivity, but they are not being handed back to American authority. The Soviet government has explicit obligations here. The Yalta Agreement, signed by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin that same February, lays out specific terms for repatriating liberated prisoners of war. Liberated Allied servicemen are to be gathered at collection points. They are to receive food, shelter, medical care. They are to be sent home as quickly as possible. The language is clear, the commitments are unambiguous, and the Soviets are ignoring them. The fragmentary reports trickling back to American military headquarters paint a picture that ranges from troubling to deeply alarming. Some of these men are being held in the very same camps they were just supposedly liberated from, under armed guard, with scarce food and minimal medical attention. Others are being transported eastward, deeper into Soviet-controlled territory, moving in the exact opposite direction from where repatriation would take them. Still others sit for weeks, then months, while the Soviet military bureaucracy processes requests with the unmistakable slowness of an institution that has received specific instructions not to rush. Why is the Soviet Union refusing to return American prisoners of war in the winter and spring of 1945? Historians have offered competing explanations for 8 decades now. The answers do not cancel each other out. They stack. One explanation centers on Moscow's own repatriation crisis. Millions of Soviet citizens spent the war years in German-controlled territory, as prisoners, as forced laborers, as civilians trapped under occupation. Getting them back is a strategic priority for Stalin. American cooperation in that effort is leverage. And leverage works best when you hold something the other side wants. A second explanation points to Soviet intelligence services. The Americans in custody have spent months or years inside German camps. They have seen things, heard things. Extracting that information takes time, and time requires continued physical control over the men being questioned. A third explanation is structural. The Soviet military bureaucracy operates through a blend of institutional inertia and purposeful obstruction so seamless that distinguishing one from the other is nearly impossible for anyone on the outside looking in. General George Patton does not invest much energy in parsing the reasons. Patton is driving the Third Army through Germany in those same months. His advance is colliding with the full wreckage of the German war machine: concentration camps, prisoner of war facilities, displaced persons centers, forced labor sites. Each one a physical testament to what the Third Reich has inflicted on the human beings under its authority. Patton is managing all of it at once, the logistical and administrative demands of an army in full offensive momentum, the immediate human catastrophes that each new mile of advance keeps exposing. American prisoners trapped in Soviet-held territory represent a crisis Patton has no direct lever to solve. These men sit behind Soviet lines, ground where American military authority carries zero weight, held by an Allied army whose goodwill underpins everything the war's final chapter demands. The official machinery for addressing their fate climbs upward through the American chain of command to Eisenhower, then laterally into diplomatic channels linking Washington to Moscow. And that machinery is producing results best described as inadequate.
Patton knows this because officers dispatched to Soviet territory under Yalta's contact team provisions are feeding him reports. These are American military personnel authorized to visit collection points where liberated prisoners should be assembling, tasked with aiding repatriation and confirming the Soviets are honoring their obligations. The contact teams are getting nowhere. Checkpoints stall them. Soviet officials inform them the prisoners have been relocated elsewhere. A bureaucratic apparatus churns out paperwork, but not access. So Patton does something Eisenhower has not sanctioned, something the official American diplomatic posture does not endorse. He sends his own people in, not through Yalta's contact team framework, not through the official pipeline that ascends the hierarchy, threads sideways through diplomatic channels, and delivers the same inadequate results it has been delivering. He handpicks American officers who speak Russian and possess the precise blend of stubbornness and adaptability that unauthorized operations in Soviet territory demand. He dispatches them east with clear orders: locate the American prisoners, confirm their real condition, their real location, their real treatment. What comes back is worse than the fragmentary intelligence already trickling into Third Army headquarters through sanctioned channels. American prisoners endure conditions ranging from miserable to outright dangerous. Men who survived years in German captivity are now sick and starving, and the Soviet collection point system cannot address it. Medical care mandated by the Yalta Agreement falls far short of adequate levels. Food is insufficient. Shelter is substandard. And the repatriation timeline, which the agreement stipulates should proceed as rapidly as possible, bends to Soviet administrative rhythms that show no urgency whatsoever about what "as rapidly as possible" actually means. Patton brings this intelligence to Eisenhower. He does not deliver it as a subordinate quietly flagging a concern through proper channels. He delivers it with the force of a commander convinced that American soldiers are suffering at the hands of an Allied army, that this suffering flows from deliberate policy, not bureaucratic accident, and that deliberate policy demands a response the official channels are failing to produce. Eisenhower navigates the Soviet relationship, carrying the full weight of a supreme Allied commander who grasps a brutal arithmetic. Soviet military cooperation remains essential to Germany's final defeat. The Berlin Question, the convergence of American and Soviet forces on the Elbe, the dozens of coordination demands in the war's closing weeks, all hinge on a functional partnership with the Red Army. A direct confrontation over prisoner treatment could fracture that partnership. But he also carries the weight of a man reading the same reports Patton has read. A man who has pursued repatriation through diplomatic channels with the specific frustration of someone receiving the appearance of cooperation without the substance. The diplomatic channel Eisenhower has been working runs through the American military mission in Moscow, led by General John Dean. Dean has been managing Soviet coordination on repatriation and related questions since the mission's founding in 1943. His dispatches from Moscow through the winter of 1945 paint a remarkably consistent picture. The Soviet military engages its American counterparts with a specific, repeating method. Formal cooperation arrives promptly. Substantive cooperation never does. Agreements get signed, then ignored. Access gets promised, then denied. Dean has been warning Washington since late 1944. The pattern is not accidental. It reflects deliberate Soviet policy. Extract maximum American cooperation while returning the absolute minimum. American accommodation is producing diminishing returns. The Soviets have concluded that the accommodation will continue no matter what they do. His recommendation, laid out in a November 1944 cable that becomes one of the more consequential documents in American-Soviet diplomatic history, is blunt. The United States must stop granting concessions without receiving concrete concessions in return.
Washington receives this recommendation with the diplomatic ambivalence of a government trying to hold a wartime alliance together through its final phase, while quietly absorbing the growing evidence that the post-war Soviet relationship will be far more adversarial than Allied solidarity rhetoric has suggested. But diplomatic ambivalence could not protect the men still disappearing in the East. The Roosevelt administration is not prepared to adopt the harder line Dean recommends in November 1944, and by the time anyone is ready to consider it, Roosevelt is dead. Truman is in office. The war is weeks from ending. The prisoner repatriation question has become simultaneously more urgent and more politically volatile. Patton is not navigating the diplomatic complexity that Eisenhower and Dean are navigating. He is running the Third Army, managing its operations, living with the human consequences of those operations. And the human consequence consuming his focus right now, American prisoners held in Soviet custody whose repatriation is not proceeding at the pace the Yalta Agreement demands. He decides to send a rescue mission. The decision is not authorized by Eisenhower. It is not coordinated with Soviet military command. It does not pass through the contact team framework that the Yalta Agreement establishes for precisely this type of operation. It is a unilateral decision by a theater commander who has concluded that official channels have failed, that the men in Soviet hands cannot afford to wait for official channels to produce results. The mission goes to Major Ernest Grunberg, one of the Russian-speaking officers Patton has specifically identified for this kind of work. A man possessing the rare combination of language capability and operational judgment the situation demands. Grunberg takes a small team east, deep into Soviet-controlled territory. His objective is specific: locate American prisoners, begin moving them westward toward American lines, regardless of what Soviet military bureaucracy dictates about proper repatriation procedure. What Grunberg discovers when he reaches the Soviet-controlled areas confirms the worst reports filtering back to Patton through unofficial channels. American prisoners scattered across multiple locations, conditions ranging from miserable to actively dangerous. Soviet military personnel responsible for these men, operating under instructions that clearly do not prioritize the repatriation the Yalta Agreement requires. Grunberg begins moving men. He does not request Soviet authorization. He does not submit paperwork through the contact team framework. He identifies Americans, gets them on their feet, and starts them westward toward Third Army lines. The Soviet military's reaction to Grunberg's operation is exactly what you'd expect from a bureaucracy that has just been bypassed by someone who decided its timeline was unacceptable. There are confrontations at checkpoints. Soviet officers demand documentation the mission cannot produce, because the mission was never sanctioned within any framework that would generate such paperwork. Communications flow from Red Army officers to their American counterparts. The tone is unmistakable. Displeasure at the unauthorized nature of this operation, formal requests to shut it down. Patton does not shut it down. The Soviet complaints about Grunberg's operation climb higher. They reach Eisenhower, delivered as official Red Army communiques protesting unauthorized American activity in Soviet-controlled territory, demanding that American command rein in its subordinates and route all operations through proper channels. Eisenhower finds himself in a position that is uncomfortable in the precise way positions become uncomfortable when a subordinate has done something unsanctioned, that is also delivering results the sanctioned channels never delivered. When the thing that shouldn't have been done is the thing bringing men home. Patton receives word from Eisenhower regarding the necessity of working through established channels. He receives the messages. He acknowledges them. He continues the operation. This is pure Patton, the management of friction between personal conviction and the authority above him. The pattern that has shaped his entire relationship with the chain of command throughout the war. The same pattern behind the slapping incidents, the speech in England, the dozen other occasions when Patton decided what was right and then dealt with the fallout afterward.
His calculation is straightforward. The consequences of rescuing American prisoners are survivable. The consequences of abandoning them to Soviet custody are not. He acts on that math. The men Grunberg's operation pushes westward start appearing at Third Army positions. Many of them are in terrible shape. Months of German captivity, followed by weeks under Soviet control, have carved a physical toll that Third Army medical staff now confront with the urgency the situation demands. Patton visits some of these men himself. The visits are not staged for cameras the way political tours of military facilities sometimes are. These are the visits of a commander who needs to see firsthand what happened to soldiers held in someone else's custody, who needs to measure the distance between what the Yalta Agreement promised these men and what they actually got. What he witnesses in those visits hardens every instinct forming inside him since May 1945 about the Soviet system and what it portends for the post-war order rising from the wreckage of the German one. The American prisoners held by the Soviets had not been subjected to the deliberate cruelty of the German camps. They were not victims of a systematic extermination program or organized torture, but they had been treated as instruments of Soviet policy, not as individual human beings carrying rights the Yalta Agreement had spelled out and the Soviet state was obligated to honor. They were detained longer than the agreement required, moved in directions the agreement never contemplated, leveraged as bargaining chips in a repatriation negotiation the Soviets conducted on one core assumption, that American cooperation could be purchased cheaply because the Americans needed Soviet military partnership more than the Soviets needed American goodwill. Patton speaks about this.